Oh, we're moving stuff. Okay. Oh, you have to like put the screen first. Cool. Okay, does this happen? Can you do that? Okay, I might have to like point. I don't want to like do this. Yeah. All right, great. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Ian, and I'm here to talk to you about question generation. So how well do you know your audience towards socially aware question generation? This is joint work with my former advisor at Michigan, Radha Mahelsha, and I'm happy to be here. So let's get started. Okay. One of the goals of my advisors group is to help people sort of reflect on their writing better. And one sort of idea we came up with was this idea of preemptive question generation. So people who are writing in a new domain may often omit important information that could help their audience respond more effectively to what they've written. For example, a person who's seeking legal help for the first time may receive different feedback from experts or from fellow novices. And this sort of feedback, you know, they could wait until they're done writing, or they could sort of get it in the middle of writing and potentially change what they've written to communicate more effectively. This is obviously not a new problem. This is a long-standing problem, and there's actually some online forums that address this kind of missing information problem with sort of automated reminders or strict rules about what people are allowed to write. I show an example here of this Reddit account called LocationBot, whose sole purpose is to read people's posts on a certain subreddit and basically say, it looks like you forgot to include your location. So this is going to make it hard for people to give you advice if they don't know where you're living. So providing this kind of preemptive feedback could help people write more effectively and connect with their audience more effectively. Okay, so natural question, what if we generate preemptive questions to help people write either more effectively or more authentically? Okay. So this leads me to the next point about question generation, which I don't think has been properly addressed in prior work, which is the idea of sort of social factors in questions. So people with different backgrounds may ask different kinds of questions. Subject area experts may often focus on underlying issues for a particular problem, whereas novices may focus on sort of surface level problems. And this, you know, naturally leads to think, okay, what kind of background information is likely to change the expectations around different questions? There's lots of different ways to sort of, you know, differentiate people and the kinds of questions they ask. We can think of a couple different ones right off the bat. We can think of demographics. So the place where you live, your location can sort of change the way that your expectations and your questions that you ask. Your expertise can change your questions. So an expert versus novice, like I said before. And then your attentiveness. So people who respond kind of quickly, ask questions quickly, maybe have a different thought process than people who respond slowly. So I show here kind of an example from our data that was massively simplified because we have really long documents. So there's this person who's writing this post about being stuck in debt and sort of making purchases they can't afford. And so ideally, you know, if we're really adapting to different kinds of questions, we would want a system that can sort of take as input the type of person asking the question, so if it's an expert or a novice, and then generate questions that kind of match the expectations of those groups. So in this case, the expert asked roughly, you know, what are your expenses? The novice asked, do you have a budget? Which intuitively is a little bit more simple. It's just a yes or no question, whereas the expert question is like, okay, tell me what your budget is. Okay, so this brings me to the goals of the study. So first question, how different are questions that are asked by different social groups? And second, how accurately can we generate questions for specific social groups using kind of a modified existing generation models? All right, so you're probably wondering what data do you use to do this kind of work? There are few, if any, question generation data sets that have longitudinal information about the people asking the questions. For good reason, it's very difficult to collect this. It's, you know, sort of very fragile over time. But for people who don't do question generation, the typical setup is to have some long text document that's written for a general audience, like a Wikipedia article or a scientific article, with follow-up questions that people are likely to ask. A lot of question generation work right now focuses on controllable attributes like difficulty for things like education, or it focuses on smarter use of global domain knowledge data. So what seems interesting to ask about? So this is kind of exemplified by the 3 data sets I show here, which includes Wikipedia questions, Amazon questions, and Squad, which some people are probably familiar with. So for at least this particular project, these are a little bit too generic and didn't have enough sort of social background information. So for this work, we focus on subreddits on the popular website Reddit, where people often seek advice. So this is not a rare thing. People often seek advice from specific groups and need to revise their posts to address these kind of clarification questions. So I show here an example of a post from Legal Advice where someone paid rent and then was basically asked to vacate. So as I said before, advice seekers could benefit a lot from this kind of preemptive feedback, and it could save a lot of waiting time for very basic feedback, like where are you located, which is shown in this one question that someone asked in response to this post. So I forgot to include this data, but we looked at sort of 5 broad topics. We looked at finance, legal advice, technology, relationship advice, and then general life advice as sort of the advice seeking subreddit, different domains. So this brings me to my first research question, which is who are the people asking these questions and can we predict their questions in advance? All right, so at this point, you're probably wondering, how do we actually define these different social groups? There's lots of different ways to do this, but we focus on people's background information as a way to sort of categorize the potential groups that they're a part of. So as I said before, we're looking at 3 different broad groups. We're looking at expertise. So how much does a question asker likely know about the particular domain? We're looking at time. So how quickly did the question asker respond to the original post? And then location. So where is the likely location of the person asking the question? So to extract this information, we collect up to 1,000 prior comments from every question asker and make inferences about their background based on their comment behavior. For example, we consider question asker A an expert in the realm of finance if A previously posted in finance-related subreddits. I'll show an example here. So again, this post about being stuck in debt was in our data. We looked at this person asking this question, what are your expenses? We looked at their previous posts. We found that they tended to post overwhelmingly in subreddits related to financial concerns. So using this information, as well as sort of cutoffs that we defined, we sort of just labeled this person as expert. We had a similar process for time and location, which I can explain at the end if people have questions. All right, so I just show here a summary of the social groups. Beautiful table. So I show, for example, in the first row, we have expertise. So again, just a very rough idea of expertise, so the prior rate of commenting. And I show some example questions from experts and novices for sort of example question in personal finance. The expert question, as kind of expected, is a little bit more complicated and is a little more hypothetical. The novice question is a little bit more surface level and easy to understand. All right, so using this information, our first question was, do these social groups actually tend to ask different kinds of questions? If not, then maybe the social groups themselves are not really meaningful. And we do this with both classification and with descriptive analysis. So for classification, we train just a single layer neural network using the embedding of the question generated from a sentence embedding model, and do k-fold validation. We find that using both the question text and the post plus question text, these groups are differentiable. So you can, with a fairly high degree of accuracy, tell whether or not someone is an expert based on the question that they ask. Same with time and location. We also verify differences using differences in lexical use. So we use these lexicons called LIWC, which are linguistic inquiry word counts, which are often used in sort of personality analysis, as well as different kinds of content analysis. And find that there are sort of significant differences between the different questions that people ask in terms of groups. So I show on top sort of differences in terms of the words that people use based on location. So at least in our data, the people in the US tended to focus more on money words, work words, and relative words, whereas non-US versus US focused more on focused present, functional words, auxiliary verbs, which could indicate sort of differences in intention when they're asking questions. So at least according to descriptive and predictive analysis, we find that these groups are differentiable, which is a good first step. But second step, can we actually generate these questions? That's much harder. Okay. So you're probably wondering now, how do we incorporate the actual background information into existing generation models? And people have done this in lots of different ways. In this work, we're kind of interested in comparing discrete representations versus continuous representations. So I'll explain that right now. So we have two different approaches to discrete representations for these social groups. The first one is just appending a single token to the end of the input to say whether or not the question is going to be asked by an expert or a novice. This is similar to plug and play models, as well as probably other models you're aware of. We also look at, so we're building this on top of a transformer model, which has different like attention layers. So we also try out sort of a socially specific attention layer and combine that with the generic attention to sort of generate a customized attention distribution for a particular question. So those are the discrete approaches. We compare this with continuous representations, where we actually generate a single embedding for every question asker based on their previous text that they've written and the previous sort of subreddits that they posted in. And our hypothesis initially was that the continuous representations would do a little bit better than discrete representations because they capture more of the variance in the data. Okay, so I try to summarize these with some little diagrams. So in the social token approach, it's literally just taking the input text, so example input text end, and then appending some token like expert, which is then learned during training. That's the sort of simplest model. The other discrete model is the social specific attention model, where instead of just a generic attention, we train both that as well as a separate attention layer for every social group. We pass those through a linear layer to generate the final attention distribution, which we hypothesize is kind of a weighted combination of generic and sort of socially specific attention. Lastly, for the continuous representation for those embeddings I was talking about, we take that previous comments from all of the question askers, and we generate embeddings for the text using doc2vec, and then just compute the average of those for like the text embedding. And we compute the social embeddings using, we basically have a large co-occurrence matrix of subreddits and users, which we compress using SVD to generate a single embedding for every subreddit. We then compute the average of those embeddings to get sort of a social embedding for every user. Great, so that's our approach to sort of socially aware question generation. And the prediction problem is what you would expect. So we're trying to predict question Q from a given text context C with or without the social information. And we built all of our models on top of a BART transformer model. And we used a text-only model. So only the text of the original post, no social information as the baseline. And all models were trained with the same hyperparameters for a fair comparison. And they were trained to minimize cross entropy loss. Okay, so it leads me to results. So I'll show first the results of the automated evaluation. So we use sort of typical generation metrics, including BLEU, rouge, perplexity, diversity, and redundancy. We find that, surprisingly, we find that the social token model does roughly the same as the text-only model, and the other models actually sort of struggle in terms of typical metrics. However, we note that some of the socially aware models are sort of more diverse. So they tend to generate output that is, not always like correct, at least according to the reference, but that does tend to be a little bit more diverse. So it suggests that these social models are potentially more creative, potentially, more, generating questions that are a little bit less expected compared to the baseline. So not a great first result. We sort of expected that including social information would at least not make things worse. But we decided to look a little bit deeper at the data and look at different kinds of questions. So our next step is to identify sort of subtypes of questions that we hypothesize would be best suited for this by this social model. We look at first questions that are divisive. So we define divisive questions as those which have low semantic similarity between question 1 versus question 2 for groups 1 and 2. So taking a question from an expert and a question from a novice, we define it as divisive if those questions have very low semantic similarity. So that's our first sort of set of questions that we think the social model will do better with. We also look at group-specific questions. So we look at questions that have a very high probability of a group given the question based on the prediction of the classifiers that we defined for research question 1. So these are intuitively questions that are strongly associated with like experts or with novices. And just the TLDR is that we find that the social token model actually does better for these sort of subtypes of questions. So both divisive and group specific questions. So I show that here. So the left table is the results for divisive questions, where the similarity of the questions is, lower than some threshold. We find that, the performance of the other models like social attention and embeddings is kind of mixed. We find that consistently the social token model does sort of nudge its way past the text-only model for these very divided questions. Similarly, for the group-specific questions, we break this down by different groups. Thank you. And we find that especially for location, so questions associated with a particular user location, the social token model does again sort of edge its way past the text-only model, which is sort of a small but positive sign for our model. All right, I'm going to skip this. Lastly, we look at human evaluation. So we provide generated questions from both the text-only baseline, as well as the ground truth and the social token model to annotators on Prolific, which were recruited based on expertise. So for our legal questions, we only allowed lawyers to answer sort of, the annotation task. And we had two different annotation tasks. The first one are the questions understandable, relevant, and answerable, which we had people judge on a Likert scale. And I'll sort of do the TLDR first, is that overall the social token model questions are considered more answerable. And then if you break it down by subgroup, the social token model does do better for sort of the demographics, so for location-specific questions, as well as a more subjective domain, where we had a particular subreddit that was associated with basically relationship problems that it turns out the social token model was kind of more well-suited for. So we have that in a giant table here. And yeah, just to reemphasize for this location result, we changed the name. The social token model does a little bit better in terms of answerability and readability or relevant scores, at least for this particular group. And then sort of similar story for this one subreddit that's a little bit more subjective. Again, the social token model does a little bit better than the text-only model. The second task was having humans guess the social group associated with the question. So we generated for a given post, a question by an expert and novice, asked them to guess which one was the expert, which was the novice. Turns out humans are not very accurate at this task, but the results do mirror what we saw before in the part one human evaluation. So we find that humans are better at guessing the social group for location-specific questions as well as questions within this sort of subjective domain. So at least there's consistency across the human evaluation, even if the results overall are not as high as we expected. Okay, that is a sort of sample question. We can get to that in questions if people want to see some examples. I'll go through limitations briefly. I think the biggest one, which I want to acknowledge, is that there's no human validation of the social groups. So we define these categories just based on prior posting behavior and sort of cutoff values, but we never, show. We never really validate whether the people who we label as experts are actually, would be considered more knowledgeable by, some human annotator looking through their previous posts. It's also important to note that the social groups may not mean the same thing across domains. So an expert in a legal domain may be someone like a lawyer, and that kind of expertise is very different from an expert in like a personal relationship who may be like a therapist or a counselor. So there is some degree of sort of variability across domains that we do want to emphasize here. Great. So there's a couple of limitations I can talk about in discussion if we're interested, but for now I'll move on to the conclusion. So we find that actually simpler models are better for this kind of socially aware question generation, which could be a limitation of the data, or it could be just the task itself is potentially, simpler is better. We also find that the social token model, so that simpler model, is better for questions that are divisive and socially specific, and for concrete social groups like location and subjective domains like this relationship subreddit. So the sort of big takeaway from this work, which I didn't expect going into it, which is that these socially aware question generation models may be better in socially specific advice scenarios rather than kind of all kinds of advice scenarios. Specifically for concrete social signals rather than maybe more fuzzy social signals. Okay, am I doing okay on time? Okay, great. Okay, future work. So we're really interested in building on this and sort of looking at medical questions, specifically because medical questions are really complicated, and it's often very difficult for people with new diagnoses to navigate sort of medical domains. So people who are newly diagnosed with a particular ailment often have very complicated questions about their conditions, often due to their medical or life history. So someone who's recently diagnosed with cancer may have a question like, what are the side effects of chemotherapy on my everyday life? Which is a fairly complicated question. It's not easily answered. Thank you. In this future work, we're interested in looking at a better way to leverage patient knowledge besides just sort of bidding people into these very blunt social groups like experts, novices. And our idea is to try to figure out what people are likely to not know. And we're hoping to condition question generation on the difference between what is expected of a patient to know versus what they actually know. So just giving an example here, if we have some question asker here who has previous, information about their cancer diagnosis, and they ask this question about, what are the side effects of chemotherapy on everyday life? We may hypothesize that we can predict that question better if we understand the sort of global space of knowledge within a domain. Thank you. And we try to generate it using this sort of set difference. Okay, thank you very much for listening. If you're an expert, maybe you have that first question to prompt you. If you're a novice, maybe you have that second question. Happy to answer both. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much for this talk. Any questions from the audience?
Very nice. Very exciting topic as well. So I was, you talked about the social groups that have to do with knowledge mainly, but I'm wondering, what about opinions? So basically creating social groups based on different opinions that people have, and then articulating questions that in some way reflect, I mean, a question is about a fact, but most of the time when you have an opinion, you can't, a question is more of a comment, this type of question. So yeah, I'm wondering, have you thought about it? Would be easy to do? Would it be useful? I don't know, your thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny, this work actually started not with advice questions at advice people, questions directed at news stories, and their opinions definitely come out. So we saw very big differences between like political leanings, for example. So like, the Republican response to a COVID story is very different from Democrat response. Yeah, I think we were interested in that, but had a little bit of trouble defining like what an opinion is and sort of how to differentiate people apart from like, I know a little bit about politics, but like apart from that, it gets a little sketchy. And I think that opinions are extremely useful in more subjective domains. In this work, we wanted to focus more on not really objective domains, but domains where there was very clear like missing information. But I think in future work, it'd be really interesting to look at domains where it's not just what's missing, but also what your perspective is. Yeah, good question.
Any other questions?
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, David Trowell from USC. So your questions and the talking about the different groups and information lack, that's focusing more on a kind of semantic level or information level. And I think your questions are focused mainly on the textual level. And I wonder if you thought about how to reconcile those where, very often two groups might ask the same textual questions, but they're expecting very different answers. How do you connect those?
Oh, okay.
together?
So you're saying they'll ask a question that like at the surface form looks similar, but as expecting different answers, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Like even your chemotherapy example, that depending on what your lifestyle is, there might be very different things to talk about.
Let me go back to that one. That's a good one. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. I think that is definitely a limitation of this work, is that the questions, we expect them to be self-contained, but they're not always self-contained, right? Like you just said, everyday life means a different thing for, different people. I think one way to, something we didn't do in this work, but I think that would be really useful would be more careful question filtering to kind of, hopefully identify questions that are a little bit more self-contained. So maybe the question is like kind of exhaustive and long and difficult to, parse for a human, but it is less ambiguous in that sense. So that's one thing I'll say. Another thing I'll say is that another approach is sort of modifying the question to contain some of that context information. That's another sort of, I guess, data filtering thing is like taking the sort of context leading up to the question and trying to figure out how to modify the question to include that context. So maybe earlier in the post, someone's mentioned like my everyday life includes like exercise or like eating a lot. There might be a way to, with like co-reference resolution or sort of like smart, combination, sort of combining sentences to take that contextual information and sort of jam it into the question to make it less ambiguous. Yeah, so I'd say more careful data cleaning. Yeah.
Anything else? Maybe very briefly, I have a question from the chat.
Yeah.
And it says, but it has to be brief. So the person here asks, I would like to clarify how you should pick the three social dimensions: expertise, time, and location, and whether you consider the other dimensions, and in general, what was the process to arrive there?
Yeah, that's a good question. We wanted to look at categories that we could binarize so that we could split into like sort of human interpretable, like expert versus novice, slow versus fast. These were kind of the ones that we arrived at based on prior work, which Radha Mahalsha has looked at sort of just general text differences between these kinds of groups. But certainly, so yeah, I'd say binarization. There are other dimensions, like I mentioned, politics we considered, but we sort of focused on dimensions that we thought would be applicable to advice seeking and that would be sort of easily fed into a model. And yeah, there's certainly more dimensions, but we wanted to actually get stuff done as opposed to enumerating lots of dimensions. So yeah, that's kind of my answer.
Yes. Okay. That's all. Let's have the speaker again. And